Well, today we get to peek behind the veil, then, folks. Today we get to see the power behind the throne, the reason that Roar Like the Lamb comes to you so beautifully packaged week after week. It's our very own Chris McHugh.
The emperor clearly has no pants, Father Sam. So thanks for the build up, though. You're not fooling anybody. But you know what was powerful is this Sunday was one of the most powerful homilies I've ever heard in my life, and if anybody was thinking euthanasia is okay, boy, that would change their mind with the words you spoke.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. You know who missed that homily, Chris?
Shush.
Paula.
A day to another church in Fairfield. Because, I made the 12 o'clock there.
It's okay.
I told my mother how great it was, and I told her,
wow.
I said, I wish that I had recorded it or something like that or whatever. And she goes, Chris, you realize that it's on YouTube? I said, oh yeah, that's a great point. I'll just go click on a button.
We do, in fact, have the entire recording of the homily.
So for those of us who didn't hear.
Right.
Can you reenact it?
I don't know if I should reenact the whole thing. I mean, what we could do is if we really wanted to, we could go back and we could take that video. We could just cut out the audio from the homily and splice it in here, and then people could hear the homily in its entirety. But basically what I was doing was for Divine Mercy Sunday, recognizing what mercy truly is and comparing the true mercy that Christ offers to us to the false mercy that the world offers us. And so what do we see of the true mercy of Christ? The true mercy of Christ is that he lays down his life as a sacrifice for us. He offers us forgiveness beyond anything that we deserve. Jesus gives us this tremendous gift. So his mercy is such that even when we doubt, like Thomas doubted, Jesus still comes to be with us. His mercy is one that offers us forgiveness for our sins, even though our debt is so great, right? So the real mercy that Jesus gives to us, he gives to us totally freely with no expectation of any return for himself. Then, as we read in the gospel this past Sunday for Divine Mercy Sunday, Jesus comes to the apostles, and he's already shown them what mercy looks like on the cross. And then, having shown them what that mercy looks like, he then breathes on them and says, as the Father sent me, so I send you. So he says to the apostles, now you are going to be the witnesses of mercy. Now you're going to show what mercy looks like. So now it's your job to go out and to lay down your lives. It's your job to make that sacrifice for those who need real mercy. And then he gives them the command to forgive sins. Whatever sins you forgive are forgiven. Whatever sins you retain are retained. And so we're able to see that mercy is something that was not just given once and that's it, but the mercy of God is prolonged through the apostolic ministry. So what the apostles are doing when they forgive sins is they're prolonging the real mercy of Jesus Christ, right? Then what we also learn from the cross is that we're invited to unite our own sufferings to him. We're able to, like Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross with Jesus. We're able to go with him in all things. And so whatever sufferings we have to endure or whatever sufferings we might go through, those sufferings find a meaning because Jesus suffered them first. Whatever suffering I endure, whatever difficulty I have, Jesus has already been there. He's already seen it. He's already carried that cross for me. And so I know that whatever I have to endure, I don't have to endure it alone because Jesus is there. He's already taken it to the cross for me. All right, then. So we're sent out. We're expected to, like, this gift of mercy is available to us all the time through confession. And then we are able to participate in the redemptive act by offering our sufferings, so that suffering itself, even in the midst of suffering, we still find God's mercy is present. And then we see what he does with Thomas. So here's Thomas who didn't believe, and Jesus says, come see my hands and my feet, put your fingers in the nail wounds, put your hand in my side. as he says, put your fingers in the nail wounds, put your hand in my side. What he's doing is he's inviting Thomas into his suffering. And so he gives him the command, do not be unbelieving, but believing. So the fact that he uses, I find parts of speech are very important, right? As you know, Paula. I like to get into grammar arguments and stuff. And when Jesus says, do not be unbelieving, but believing, the ing, the gerund matters, right? That this is an active present moment. This is a thing to be doing right now. So do not be unbelieving, but believing. He's saying that your faith needs to be happening right now. Believe now in this moment. But what it also means is that there's this invitation. Put your finger in the nail wounds now. Put your hand in my side now, at this time. And so it's that invitation to step into what the sufferings of Christ really look like and what they really are. So in other words, it's an invitation to accompany Jesus in that suffering. So if we're invited to accompany Jesus in the midst of suffering, then we know that we're called to walk with whoever it is who suffers. Because if my sufferings can be united to the sufferings of Christ on the cross, well, then so can the sufferings of this person over here or that person there. Anybody who suffers is united to Christ on the cross, which means that part of what Jesus sends us out to do is to bring his mercy to those who are suffering. And we do that by putting our fingers in his nail wounds, by putting our hands in his side. And basically what that comes to then is there are false ideas of mercy in our world. And the false idea of mercy is that any kind of suffering, we just need to get rid of it. There shouldn't be any kind of, we shouldn't ever feel suffering. We shouldn't ever have anybody faced with any kind of difficulty like that. Rather, we should do everything possible to get rid of any and all suffering as soon as humanly possible. And how do we usually do that? Well, there's a medical procedure. There's this quick fix. There's this, we'll just get up and leave, get out of that space, instead of entering into what that suffering means. And frankly, most of what our world sees as mercy is really an excuse. So the excuse is most of all not to put our fingers in the wound or our hands in the side. So most examples of that false mercy actually take us away from what Jesus asks us to do. So the first example that I used was true mercy, as I see it, is embodied by a place like Malta House of Good Counsel in Norwalk, right? And Paula, I know that you're familiar with Malta House and the great stuff that they do there. But Malta House provides a home, a safe place for a woman who's in a crisis pregnancy. And by providing that safe place, that home for that woman, she's given basically an indefinite period of time. I mean, there is kind of a time limit that they have, but they're given a space where they can live, where they will be safe, where their meals will be provided, where they have an opportunity for education, for job training, job networking, childcare, life skills, just basic life skills and coaching and mentoring. So these women are put in a place where not only are we saying, keep your baby, have the baby, but we're also going to give them, what they need and enter into their particular sufferings, their particular challenges. And we're going to carry that cross with them. But what our world says is that, well, if this woman's in a situation that's difficult, there's a procedure that can fix that. She shouldn't have to deal with that difficulty at all. And we pretend like it's gone, but that's not what mercy really is. Real mercy enters into that suffering and compassionately accompanies and walks with. So right now in the state of Connecticut, we are facing a similar kind of false mercy. And that false mercy is that our Judiciary Committee at the state level has advanced to the floor of the House or Senate, I can't remember which, a bill that would legalize physician-assisted suicide. And physician-assisted suicide is a fancy and sanitized name for euthanasia. Euthanasia is a grave moral evil, and euthanasia is a grave moral evil that the church has rejected for centuries. has always said no to. Euthanasia is a grave moral evil that the Second Vatican Council names explicitly as something that must always be rejected and that the church must always stand against. Euthanasia is a grave moral evil that John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis have all said can never be admitted. Francis has spoken about it actually really beautifully. He talks about a throwaway culture that views sickness or the person who is sick as an inconvenience. And so they're to be put away. And a culture that euthanizes refuses to enter into any kind of human suffering, refuses to acknowledge that there is such a thing as sickness or that there's any dignity in sickness. And instead, it says that the real dignity is in dying. That's the most important thing. Like you should do the noble thing and kill yourself, which is a horrible thing to say, right? And Chris, I don't know if you were at the mass where I said it this way, but it's the one that was recorded at the 11 o'clock. And what I said was the Nazis practiced euthanasia. And if the fact that the Nazis practiced euthanasia isn't enough for us to say we should never do that, I don't know what would convince us, right? But so the problem that we have right now is in the state of Connecticut, this is being advanced. It's supported by our Fairfield delegation to the state, our state representatives. I'm not sure about the state Senate. Actually, I think it's a little wishy-washy there. But our state reps have all supported it, including the Catholic, who's a state rep. And so it's a real disaster. It's a real problem.
That's
and
awful.
It's being pushed, and there's all kinds of other consequences that come with it. Like what happens to doctors who don't want to do this? Are they going to be coerced into killing someone?
Yeah.
And what about the Hippocratic Oath that says do no harm? What we're asking doctors to do is to do harm, so to violate the sacred oath that they take. What about, not for nothing, insurance companies? Like it's way cheaper to kill somebody than it is to keep them alive or to give them treatment for a chronic or terminal disease. And so there's serious questions about what will happen. And what we have seen in other places, like in Canada and other countries and even states where they've legalized physician-assisted suicide, or euthanasia as it should be properly called, you have people who, because they have a disability, are being offered as one possible course of quote unquote treatment, they're being offered suicide.
Yeah.
And
didn't Iceland a couple years ago, I don't know how long ago it was, they put out a statement saying that we have eradicated Down syndrome from our country. They brought it down to 0, but what it implied was that anybody who had a Down syndrome diagnosis in pregnancy was aborted.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was Iceland, but I've heard exactly that story, and it's a nightmare, right? So what it's doing is it would create this class of people who are now considered not worthy to continue living. But that's exactly the opposite of what the church understands, right? And so I'm looking out there at the congregation and seeing people who I know have dedicated themselves to caring for a terminally ill relative or a permanently disabled relative, and who have done it with heroic generosity, who have offered themselves completely. And I know from sitting at bedsides of people who are dying, I know from watching this with people who I know very well, that as painful as it is to see someone die, and nobody ever wants to see that. Nobody ever should. I wish that no one ever would have to go through that. But no one who I know who has sat with people in their final days would trade that opportunity for anything, or would wish that they had just taken care of it faster. As painful as it is to witness someone going through that suffering, it's a gift. And this is what Jesus calls us to. Put your fingers in the nail wounds, put your hand in my side. He invites us to go into that suffering with somebody. And then what happens is, instead of that person feeling like they're alone or a burden, they instead know that they're loved and they're surrounded and they're given their dignity. This is really who they are. So that's what I was trying to drive at.
I've read every article in the Connecticut Post about this for the past year or so. and the case is being made that I don't want to be a burden on my family. Uh, I want to go out as much on top as I can.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be a financial drain. And so, for a year of reading these articles and both sides of it, um, or really, it's mostly one sided in the articles, to be honest. Father Sam, your forceful 11 o'clock homily, it was forceful, it was passionate, and the most forceful and passionate uh, refute of euthanasia in the strongest terms as as you said, grave and moral evil, and then to couple that with the dignity and sickness,
Mm.
I felt like
Mm-hmm.
was the strongest argument that I've heard against as we as a society, or just even here in Connecticut, have this creep of ideas to the contrary. What I really liked is how you drew a lot in the sand and you made it black and white. And I think you offered so much clarity and did so like the way that you're explaining right now is, much more sedate because of the media in which we're doing this, and platform.
I'm a little
But
calmer now,
but the way in which you delivered it, there was no mistaking what you were saying. And you just the way in which you were saying it forcefully, I thought was very compelling and effective. And anybody who was thinking the other way, or this trickle effect was starting to come into their being, I thought that you really swatted that down very effectively, as it should be.
Thanks.
Isn't the quotes that you just mentioned? Um, I couldn't help but think and reflect like how we think sometimes we're a burden, and
Yeah.
to the point that we feel like, well, I'm not going to ask God for things. I'm a burden to God. I'm a burden to other people. And so this is really more revealing of what's happening inside. So last night I was with the New Haven young adult community to give a talk. So I gave a talk on miracles and divine mercy. So I was pulling a lot of things from the diary of Saint Faustina. And it's certain that in our life we do experience darkness, desolation, despair, suffering, discouragement, fear, doubt, and uncertainty. Where is that? But then Jesus says these words to Faustina about how he works and what his mercy is. And so he says, "My there is no misery that could be a match for my mercy. Neither will misery exhaust it." So in other words, like, we are not exhausting to the Lord. What we are going through is not exhausting to him, because as my mercy is being granted, it increases.
Mm.
The soul that trusts in my mercy is most fortunate because I myself take care of it. And without God, we are left to think that we are on our own. And that's what suffering does. Um, Without the Lord, without the cross, it doesn't make sense. We become so dependent on ourselves,
Mm.
and we think, well, we just have to do what we have to do for ourselves so that we can lighten the load for people around us. But Jesus already carried that load. He carried a cross. He carried our sin. He carried that burden. And then we aren't meant to be walking on our own in this as well. And something that I reflected on was God's answer to our suffering is his resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
That's his answer. His answer is his resurrection, and his promise is that he will always be present. It's something that he's always promised. He always promises his presence, and his answer to our suffering is his resurrection. He's like, it's not enough for me to just tell you, I'm going to show you and live it
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. And when he gives us that mercy, it's the confidence that we can have then that he's offered everything for us, and he the mercy is always there. But that question of am I a burden? Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very human question, and it comes
Mm-hmm.
maybe on the relationship with God level, like between me and God. Do I really believe that He's given me everything? Do I really
Mm-hmm.
believe? Do I really trust that He wants to give this to me? But then there's another dimension of that, which is that how often is God revealed to us not just in our own heart, in that private place, but how often is God revealed to us, or do we see God working through the presence, the friendship, the love of others? Like, how many times have we had this conversation where this person just said exactly the right word at exactly the right time, and it cut you to the core, and that was God
Mm-hmm.
speaking to you in that moment? Or
Yeah.
that person who showed up at exactly the right moment. We all have that, like those stories of,
Mm-hmm.
I was driving down the street, and if it wasn't for this person waving to me, I was really in a bad way. Or we hear those stories again and again. That feeling of being a burden, then it's not just a. It doesn't necessarily indicate that I personally have failed to trust God.
Mm.
That feeling of being a burden is a reflection on our failure as a society, as a church, to
Mm.
really and truly provide accompaniment, to really
Mm-hmm.
and truly walk with people. The reason that
Mm-hmm.
somebody feels like they're a burden or like they don't have a place is because I have failed, like me, Father Sam. I have failed to offer them that accompaniment, or because we as a church have failed to offer them that sense that they're worthy, that they deserve my help.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, what assisted suicide does is it reinforces that idea.
Mm-hmm.
It says, no, you know what? You're not worthy of being comforted in your pain.
Yeah.
Um, Instead, you're worthy of death. That's it.
Yeah.
And so to ask me to try to go with you, to accompany you in your pain, I would rather avoid getting into that. I'd rather avoid that darkness. I'd rather avoid that pain that you're in. It's easier for me. And so really, I'm deeply convinced of this, that a lot of that assisted suicide, but this also relates to a lot of our other false ideas of mercy. The
Mm-hmm.
false ideas of mercy that we have absolve us from having to actually get involved in what
Yeah.
is messy in people's lives and what is painful
Mm-hmm.
in people's lives. It gives us a chance to just say, "Oh, that must be so hard for you. You know what? Then just do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Just do whatever makes you feel good. That's what you should do. Because if I have to be bothered by getting involved in that which causes you pain, it's going to cause
Mm-hmm.
me some pain and discomfort. So I would
Mm-hmm.
rather that you just do whatever you want to do, because that's easier for me."
Yeah.
So in the end, this false idea of mercy, it doesn't just. It's not because like I don't get sucked into the false idea of mercy because I think that I have failed to trust God. I get sucked into the false idea of mercy because the world around me says, "Oh, everything's fine. Don't worry about it. You should be happy. So just do whatever makes you happy. Just do whatever makes you feel good, and please don't bother us with it."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like
I wonder if the changing of society and people having the ability to go to assisted living facilities also somehow factors into all of this. Because many years ago, this wasn't an option. And certainly for many people too, it's the only option. The spouse or family cannot give care. But I'm wondering if what is pretty much a newer dynamic in our society here
mm,
ties into this just a bit.
yeah, I think it does. We're averse to death. We don't like talking about it. And so we try to avoid seeing death or recognizing that death is a reality. We pretend that we just always have to be comfortable and happy. Um, and so, yeah, the tendency to put people aside in these places. It's interesting because a lot of the assisted livings that you see now they're amazing. Like, they're so much nicer than the old nursing homes. These assisted living facilities, they've got beautiful dining rooms. It's a really nice space. There's a little community that's there. They're really trying to improve that and kind of move in that direction. Fulton Sheen says something about this, though. He says, ah, I gotta remember exactly how he phrases it, but he says that a culture that is uh, preoccupied with death masks it by being obsessed with sex, and a culture that is preoccupied
Fascinating.
with sex masks it by being preoccupied with death. He says, so look at like the modern era right now, And what do we see but like proliferation of pornography, all kinds of just it's the sexual liberation is always the word, but we refuse to publicly discuss death. It's the thing that we couldn't possibly have a conversation about. But then he says, look at like Victorian era literature, and it's gothic and macabre, and it's all about death. And they were so uptight about talking about anything having to do with human sexuality. And he goes, the problem is that we, on the one hand, we try so hard to avoid one thing that we exaggerate the other, and then we try so hard to go the other direction that we avoid any conversation at all about death, and we then over exaggerate the other. And what the church says is, look, we always have death right in front of us. We always have a view towards death. That's why we have the crucifix in every single church, because the crucifix reminds us that Jesus suffered and died for our sins. But we also have the antidote to that death, which is his mercy and forgiveness, which is why you have confessionals that are visible in every single church. We also have that promise of new life, which is the Eucharist, the risen body of Christ given to us sacramentally at every single Mass. Life and death are right there in front of us. That's also why we celebrate marriage, because it's life, it's the beauty of what God has given to us. And so we don't ever say that this one thing has to be put off to the side or this other thing. But at different times in different cultures and different places, we overemphasize one at the expense of the other. And we end up kind of twisting ourselves in all these knots. But really, the church is always going to be about life, recognizing that death is part of life. And even in death, there's dignity. Even in sickness and suffering, there's dignity. There's worth. There's value.
Do you hear him?
No, Chris cut out.
Paula,
Oh, there we go.
I'm wondering, do you find that just in general across the board, interacting with individuals who are fully aware that they could die at any moment, of their mortality, operate very differently than individuals who might be in denial of that, or they don't want to think about that and what that means for them?
What I'm thinking at the moment are particular people in my personal life who don't necessarily have a relationship with God, but it's funny how often they speak of death, but in a joking manner. There is no reverence towards death, but it's always brought up in a very sarcastic kind of way. You see that a lot in social media, actually. Like, that's pretty prevalent, this idea that I just have this sarcastic view of death. And so I laugh. I laugh at it like, oh, it's fine. I'm just like, oh, I'm just gonna die. Or, they're on the way to a trip and they're just gonna like imagine a situation of like, oh, this is how I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die in a car crash, or I'm gonna die in an airplane. But it's just kind of thrown out there, right? Without any existential, perhaps it's an attempt to alleviate what the anxiety of death, like we're all going to die at some point, but let me cover it with a joke, and let me cover it with sarcasm. That is what I've noticed outside of anyone with a religious background, and those with more of a relationship with God. There's a looking forward to, not in the sense like, hey, like I'm still going to live in this world, but there is a looking forward to heaven. There's a different way in which you kind of live in this world where like, I can't wait to go to heaven, but it's not to say like, I want to just, I want to end my life now so I could just be there. God is present here. And when he calls me, there's a deeper peace about existing in this world, confident in this world while being shepherded into the next world.
Yeah.
So that's something that I've noticed between the two. And it's striking. It's very striking.
I, in my own mind, came up with the you're going on vacation mindset theory, where lots of people get very excited about going on vacation, and it's something to look forward to. And I had mentioned years ago, Father Sam, that that's how I need to live my life. That I'm going to die, and eventually, and I should be super excited about that, like I'm going on vacation. It's like this moment. It's really hard right now, but man, I'm going on vacation, and that's going to be awesome. So this isn't, if it's troubles you're dealing with, it's not going to last that long, But also too, uh, and I said to you, it's so hard for me, Father Sam, to have that mindset front and center, and you're like, well, that's the key. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the crux of it. and I
Yeah.
and I go back to a podcast a while back for you guys. You say, well, what can you do? You're like, be a saint. Try and be a saint. That's like
That's it.
I
Well,
think it's interesting because, oh, go ahead, Father.
I was going to say just the keeping that idea front and center, that there's something that we're looking forward to. It is hard, and the thing is that we can't think about our own death every day.
Mm-hmm.
At least not in a way that is fearful or overly preoccupied. Right? It's not a bad thing to have a little meditation on death, to recognize, Lord, I may die, and so protect me, guide me, give me the grace of a happy death. Like, these are traditional ways of praying each day, but it's with a certain sense of peace about the whole thing. But we can't constantly be thinking about it, because we just drive ourselves nuts, right? And
Yeah.
so the idea of like offering that sense of I have something to look forward to. That's what actually gives us comfort when we're faced with death. When we're faced with,
Yeah.
typically for us, with the death of a loved one. There's grief that comes with it, so we've got to grieve. We've got to enter into that sadness and recognize that the fact that this person who I love is no longer here is painful for me, and then recognizing that we are grieving and that we are sad. Part of the comfort in the midst of that grief is that confidence that there's something after this life. That something after this life is heaven. It is a new life,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a good. And sometimes also that the comfort can be that suffering here on this earth is at an end, but it's come to its end in God's time. And we can also comfort ourselves knowing that we did everything that we could for the person who we love, who has died, or that this person has had the chance to offer it all. I met with a guy today who's in his final days. He's coming to the end of his life, and we talked about that, and he said, I'm not afraid, but I'm a little bummed. And it was kind of a beautiful response, because I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm a little bummed, because he's looking at the things that he knows. He's a good man, and he's got people around him who love him
Wow.
very, very much, and he's looking at the reality that he won't be there with them. And there's a sincere sadness about that. And at the same time, he's like, I know that life is limited, that there are only so many years that I have. And so I'm not afraid of dying. And that, I think, is a beautiful sentiment too.
Yeah.
But coming back to the idea of euthanasia, I think what we're seeing there is it's actually our projection onto people who are sick. We're afraid of death.
Yeah.
We're afraid of suffering. And so the best thing to do is just not have to. I don't want anybody to have to see it. So the best thing to do would be just to get rid of it. But there's so much that happens when people are in the midst of that. And sure, there can be physical pain, but I mean, I've watched people who are, they're children and they're taking care of a parent who's dying, and to watch somebody like pick up their parents and carry them like from the wheelchair to the bed, to watch them bathe a parent or something. It's so beautiful, as painful as it is, and as much as it seems like an indignity. There's this beautiful. I mean, read Tuesdays with Morrie. You ever read Tuesdays with Morrie? It's like required reading for every high school student on the planet now. When I was a high school chaplain, I read it to make sure that I was paying attention to what the kids were reading. But it's been on the list of things that you have to read for years. It's this sports columnist named Mitch Albom, and he writes about this. I think it was a former professor of his whose name was Maury, and Maury has MS, and every Tuesday this guy started going to visit his former professor and spending time with him, and gradually over time he couldn't do things for himself anymore, and so there would be moments where he's there talking to him, and he can't do something, and so he would just ask his former student, could you do this for me, could you help me with this? So like one day he's helping him get on the toilet, and he's thinking to himself that as this must be so terribly embarrassing, so humiliating for this man. um, and Maury's making jokes about it and teasing him about it, but then giving him the most sincere thank you for helping me. And what he realized was that in the midst of this seeming indignity, his teacher was learning and teaching at the same time, both learning the lesson and teaching the lesson of what it is to accept help from others, what it is to help somebody else unlock their capacity to serve and to help. I mean, most people who are taking care of a loved one don't have a medical background. They don't have any training in it, but they learn, and they learn so beautifully. There's so much goodness that comes out of human beings. Euthanasia suggests that there is no goodness in human beings. There's no good that we can possibly offer. There's nothing that we can help with. There's nothing that we can do that will make a difference. And that's just a lie. It's not true. We are capable of so many great things.
Yeah. I'm trying to find something from, if you're familiar with Chris Stefanik, he's a very popular Catholic podcaster, speaker,
Heard of him a
MC.
couple times.
Amazing. Heard of, yeah, he's kind of a big deal. So, anyways, recently I think his eldest daughter was diagnosed with MS, and
Huh.
I think she's only in her early 30s.
Okay.
And so to have this diagnosis that her body is going to just deteriorate away. She's married, she's got a couple kids. So he actually does a video with his daughter, because what Chris says is that he had just given a talk on joy
Mm.
and choosing joy and receiving it. And as soon as he's done giving his talk, he gets a call from his daughter about her diagnosis.
Mm.
And Chris says, it's one thing to preach it, it's another thing now to be invited to live it
Yeah.
alongside my daughter.
But that invitation to live it, that's
Yes.
here's look at my hands,
And
look at my feet, put your fingers in the nail wounds and put your hand in my side.
yes. And so this daughter, it's his, I have to find it. It's so beautiful, but the acceptance with which she is has received this diagnosis and is accepting it, and knowing that she's being accompanied by Jesus is so clear. And so the way that she speaks about her suffering, the way that she speaks about her diagnosis, there is a deep peace
Mm.
that is within her. Like, this is how Jesus wants me to be united to him. This is how Jesus is calling me to unite myself to him. And so she receives that. It's like, how beautiful is that? And like Saint Faustina herself, the one who Jesus asked to go out and promote the message of his mercy to the entire world. This is where we get Jesus, I trust in you. She herself suffered physically, to be a martyr for love, to be a martyr for his mercy, so that others may receive it. So we don't know what good is going to come out of it, but God is always good, and God always desires our good.
Mm.
That's never going to change, and I know that it's so hard to see that when you're in the midst of it. And so to have people who are walking with you to remind you, to be like the hope in your hopelessness, the capacity that we each have in order to bring Jesus to another,
Mm-hmm.
but to also allow ourselves to be encountered by Jesus himself in another who is suffering.
Mm.
You don't want to take that away. And that's where God is working. That's where God is doing things.
And what's so amazing is people that are able to keep their chin up and keep in good spirits through all of this.
Mm.
It's always amazing to me when you have someone who's just a champion at that, whether they're on either end. Um, of that, of helping or needing help. And then, on a happy note too, I think of in this life, even 1 second, 30 seconds of joy, what is that worth? Isn't that worth an eternity of happiness? Just that 1 second, and I guess it comes with the old adage of accentuate the positive a little bit,
Yeah.
which is a little bit of a silly way to boil it down, but just the joy of going to mass 2 Saturdays or Sundays ago, and sitting there with my family, and God gave me this sense, I feel, of relief that my son, he recently told me and my wife that he prays in the morning before school, and the fact that he doesn't complain to come and sit there next to me at 19 years old, and that my 9-year-old,
yeah, you got a gift there, Chris. That's a gift.
Yes, and my 9-year-old, sitting there next to us, going to religious ed, just what a sense of relief that like things are in order as they should be, which is very rare to even have for any fleeting moment, I feel like, in life.
Can I just go on the record here too and say I'm really disappointed that Haley was not allowed to keep her appendix in a jar when they removed it. And I was really hoping that would happen, and I feel deep regret. And I hope that she doesn't feel that same regret, because it's weird, but I feel a deep regret for her. I'll feel all the regret on her behalf so she doesn't have to.
Sounds like a you issue.
I was so excited about telling that story and began telling it to many people. I'm like, oh, Father Sam caught wind of the fact that she's going to go get this procedure, and then said she should keep it, and then also went off on a side jag about how perhaps she's a character in some type of series where she is a college roommate new, and she's like, hold on, my appendix is over here, I have to say goodnight to it. And there was that whole side jag there too, and I thought I was telling it very well and people would understand it, but then I realized it's one of those moments in time where you just have to be listening to the podcast, otherwise you think this Father Sam person I'm referring
really
to is
weird.
Is odd. Yeah, and then I tried to manipulate the way I was telling it to make it more like normal.
It's not just an oddity, Chris. It's that you and I have a similar way of thinking. So like when I said she'd be a vignette in a either at the beginning of a coming of age sort of college movie, or as like a flashback scene where it's like a cameo appearance of this, like she's having this memory, and then it's the scene's over in 30 seconds or less. It's one of those kinds of things that I can describe that, and I know that you immediately have a category in which to put that from this movie or this TV show that you've seen before. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And so without having to fully explain it, you just get it and you laugh. And then you're right. Then we try to explain it to people who don't think like us. And Chris, that's where we come up against the wall.
Yeah. There was a great line in a television show where somebody was just weird, and the person does what was it called when you break the third wall and you talk to the audience? You're not supposed to, and they're just like, they get like that, they watch too much TV, and I was just like, that's all of us, isn't it really? At some point you're just like, you've been so influenced by this media that you're envisioning things as like cutting to a scene or what.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the sheer number of Family Guy cutaways that I have stored in my head that have nothing to do with anything else, it's a little bit embarrassing, and Paula's experiencing that embarrassed right now.
She's embarrassed. I'm not experiencing embarrassment. It's more
she's
like
deeply disappointed in me.
IDC. I don't care.
I didn't understand that show initially.
I didn't understand it either. That's why I don't understand. So I'm like, this thing is so dumb, and so I never watched it.
I started to understand it because two things happened. One, there was a clip about Bridgeport, Connecticut. Where Father Sam, do you recall the references?
I could almost recite it verbatim, but I won't, because this is a family podcast.
I'm gonna have to look it up after this. Then
it's when Stewie goes to the North Pole. Okay, he says,
and he ends up in Bridgeport.
He says, what is he opens the gate and he takes one look at the North Pole and goes, what is this, Bridgeport, Connecticut? And then the next scene is a guy from Bridgeport angrily writing a letter about how Bridgeport leads the nation in stray dogs, broken glass, and a couple of other things. And it's like, it's so bad, but it's so funny.
and me for living in Yonkers, New York for so long, like I get the Bridgeport vibe, right? Because I remember like everybody's so down on Yonkers, everybody wanted to move out. It was one of the few places where crime would happen. Working at News 12, and they wouldn't say, I just want to stay in the neighborhood. We got to band together. They'd be like, I'm moving out. And then one time though, I was at Walgreens. And I saw out of the corner of my eye, I'm like, oh, it says I love Yonkers. It's a magnet. I'm like, this is the first I've ever seen of this. And then I realized as I got closer, it actually just said Heart Yonkers. I'm like, oh, it actually says love Yonkers. Like Yonkers needs love. It's not even I love Yonkers. It's like it needs a but
It's a
the
command.
it is love Yonkers. But the Family Guy thing, I didn't understand the accent or anything, and then we went last summer to travel, and we're going into the parking lot of my son's lacrosse tournament, and the guy there at the booth says, oh, you can park your car over here, and I'm like, I got it right away. I'm like, oh, this is how you talk about the bubbler and everything like that. And then I was blessed to have basically the entire cast of Family Guy behind me at the new Sacred Heart Stadium.
Yes.
It's literally the only visiting people there, and they're from Massachusetts, and everything was like about the farts and everything like that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so I'm starting to appreciate Family Guy more.
Well, and what's funny is like you talk about the accent. Bridgeport actually has its own micro accent. People who were born and raised in Bridgeport, they have a distinctive way of speaking that's different from like the towns right around it. You can.
Okay.
Do you know? Is it heavy on the D's?
It's a little heavy on the D's. I'd have to like really think hard about. There's one guy who I knew who had the heaviest of the Bridgeport accents that I had ever heard of, and I'd have to really think and kind of get into the character in order to do it, and I won't have time right now. But I want to come back to something that you said, Chris, to get us back on topic instead of talking about Bridgeport and accents and stuff.
Family Guy.
No, that was actually supposed to be the topic. It was in the rundown. It was this other stuff.
No, you mentioned like that idea of finding humor and also peace, joy, like all of these things kind of come in. So many years ago, when I had the chance to spend the summer with the Missionaries of Charity in Madrid, I don't talk about this particular story all that often, but one of the early experiences that I had was they had a home for men with AIDS, and one of the men there was dying. I think I had been there for 2 weeks. My second week, I think, is when he died, and they were sitting up with him. They were taking care of him. They had a doctor, they had a nurse, they had other volunteers, and so they asked me to sit with him one night so that the doctor, the nurses could get some sleep. So I took the overnight shift with him, and as I got there, it was late at night. It wasn't quite bedtime for all the guys, and one of the other men who lived there came in. He knocked on the door, and he came in, and he was blind, and he sat down in the chair, and he started to talk, and he was asking me questions, and then he started talking to the man who was dying, and he was kind of in and out of consciousness. As the nurse said, he's agonizing. It was like he wasn't ready to die, but he was in great pain, and he was trying to hold on for some reason. And so this guy who came in sits down and starts talking to him, and he says, I can hear your pain, and I want you to be okay. So I'm going to sing for you. And he starts to sing. It was the worst thing I've ever heard in my life. It was such bad singing. He was so off key, but he was trying so hard. And I could see the man getting more and more uncomfortable, and he's rolling in his bed, and he's like trying to roll over, and he doesn't quite have the strength for it. So I just put my hand out, and I grabbed this guy's hand as he was singing. And I said, I think that's enough. That's beautiful. Thank you. And he goes, okay, good night. And he gets up and he leaves. And then the guy calmed down in the bed. He was like, and then he could kind of breathe again. But sitting with him, it was amazing because the next day, his family came, and I was talking with the nurse about it, and she said he came here, he ran away from his family, and he refused to go and see them, and we've been trying to find them. They lived 3 blocks away. His family was right in the neighborhood. They had no idea where he was. He had run away from home. Run away from home is not the right word. It sounds like he's a little kid running away. He was a grown man, and he caught up in drugs and all kinds of other things. He just refused to go home. He was so ashamed of everything. And there's a deeply wounded and broken relationship there as well. But he never felt that he could go home. But what he didn't know was that his family had always been looking for him. They wanted to know where he was. They were trying to find him. They wanted to help him. And so he agreed, when the sisters made the connection with his family, he agreed to see his family, and he agreed to see everybody except for his father. He didn't want to see his father. And so his mother and his siblings came in, and they spent time with him, and they had a huge moment of reconciliation, which is very, very powerful. And then they left, but they asked him, please let your father come tomorrow. And so he finally agreed, and his father came, and they had their time together. I think his father spent 3 or 4 hours with him that day. And they were able to talk. There was apparently a very powerful reconciliation that took place. His father was able to apologize. The son was able to apologize. They forgave each other. And that night, he wasn't agonizing anymore. It was all that physical pain that he had been experiencing was literally gone, and he died very, very peacefully that night. And so there's this other aspect of being with somebody in their suffering. It gives them the opportunity. It gives them the chance, the time to say what they need to say, to ask for forgiveness, to offer forgiveness. It gives people who need closure, who need forgiveness, the chance to come and ask for it or offer it. And most of all, it gives you that chance to like relive the happiest memories or the strangest memories, like having a blind person come in and sing off key for you for a little while, right? Like all these things are happening there. And there's such dignity in it, such beauty, but it's not always easy.
That's a really good way to end.
Yeah. All right. Hey, Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for
It was
being our
awesome
producer.
to have you.
I needed this today. I literally needed this.
Chris is behind the scenes, taking care of us, making sure that you can hear our voices, making sure that all the cool stuff that we're supposed to be doing is done. Chris McHugh, thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for making us a production.
Honestly.
I mean, we kind of make it a production anyway, but like you make that production.
You legitimize it.
No, it's all you guys. I'm
Thanks,
blushing.
All right. Well, it's been great to have Chris McHugh with us. This is Roar Like the Lamb. I'm Father Sam Kachuba.
And I'm Paola Pena.
I'm Chris McHugh.
Yes, he did it.
That's so
glad.
good.
Thanks, Chris.